So I've heard from one of the people she's willing to join the team. And I tried to log in on
Oh, really? We can just start it on your laptop and I can join.
We're live.
Links up and everything?
Mm-hmm. Yep, stream's up and everything right now. The only thing is I might have issues with people's heads blocking the names of the people on the
Names should be fine.
like there's just some like heads that might be in the way, but that's it.
As long as we get their faces. Because they'll all be introduced.
On the live streaming, that means folks can sign in and watch it? Is that the idea?
It's on YouTube.
It's on YouTube? Live?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Is that how it works?
Yeah.
Okay.
And you don't have it unlisted right now, right?
Yeah, I have it.
Is anybody? Can you tell if there's anybody watching it? Or?
Yeah, we have 9 viewers right now.
Really?
And also audio's on over here, so just be mindful of that.
It's remarkable, this wonderful technology. I never cease to be amazed.
Is the battery anything to worry about?
I think we're fine in bit rate. It shows this as 144p auto, but like the max it's happening is 360. If no one like says anything on the YouTube side, I think we should be okay. I don't think anyone's going to speak at that left turn, right?
I don't know if they're going to do the introductions at the left. But there is going to be someone on Zoom. I don't know if they're going to project it out first.
join, and then the video will change to what you said.
Hey Michaela, is the Zoom going to be on both screens? Okay, thank you.
I'll also zoom out a little bit and like angle it up then.
gonna zoom out.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing. It's gonna zoom out.
Okay. I don't know if they're gonna speak right away.
I had to move around the camera, so apologies about that audio. We can fix bitrate in the OBS settings. It's less than it's definitely something. Yes. Preferences. Okay, China's 400. Should I try raising that and see what it does? Yeah, it's ending. Let's see. Yeah, let's do fine. That improves volume. But it's not like it's one thing is I know it's in time here, but it's outputting 360. It might be because of the way set up is on this computer. Is output. Was probably set as encoder percent. Yeah, it's supposed to output this well. That's probably a Wi-Fi issue.
Should we ask the TTS guy?
I think we should be fine right now. CPU is fine. I can probably raise a bit reading it more. You didn't say behind the camera to the people on the screen here. The screen quality looks really bad, just let me know.
Can you guys hear us on Zoom? Yep. We can hear us. The mic picks up the whole room, so everyone in the audience talking.
Very good.
So it's kind of hard to hear.
All right, I think we could get started. Good morning, everybody. I'm Abby Williams, Professor of the Practice of International Politics at the Fletcher School and British College of Civic Life. So it's my pleasure to welcome you to the first full day of EPIIC 2023. We look forward to a terrific day of panels and enlightening and challenging conversations, and we will get right to that shortly. I did just want to take a moment, since we're here in the beautiful Cummings Center, to acknowledge the support for this symposium and in prior years' events that the Cummings Foundation has provided through its 100K for 100 Community Grants program. So it's terrific support from the Cummings Foundation. We're so grateful for this investment, and to everyone who has had a hand in developing, supporting, and participating in EPIIC 2023. And with that, I'll turn it over to Eva.
Good morning, everyone. I'm pleased to welcome you all to this year's EPIIC Symposium on Race and International Relations. My name is Eva Vanderlo. I am a Tufts junior studying International Relations and Chinese. Thank you for joining us for our second panel of the Symposium on Environmental Racism and the Climate Crisis. An increasingly salient issue within global politics, the progressively visible effects of climate change are already beginning to unfold at rapid rates. Fast action has not materialized, and the catastrophic consequences of climate change are painfully clear, appearing last year as scorching wildfires on the west coast of North America, deadly floods in Pakistan, and famine in Africa. Along with the urgent need to address these catastrophic climate outcomes, it is also imperative to confront the less visible but equally harmful effects of the climate crisis, exemplified by drinking water contamination and the growing prevalence of pollution-induced health consequences. Because of existing power structures relating to race, development, and wealth, the negative externalities associated with climate change have proven to fall disproportionately onto the shoulders of historically marginalized populations. In the US, environmental inequality mirrors other forms of discrimination and oppression, which can be briefly epitomized by the overlap of current urban heat islands and the racially motivated policies of redlining. On the global scale, climate injustice can be illustrated by disproportionate burden sharing, where advanced wealthy countries whose emissions contributed most greatly towards climate change shove their climate responsibilities on resource-scarce states. These asymmetrical climate repercussions are by no means an exhaustive list, as the heart of the climate crisis is a social justice issue and permeates all aspects of society. Overcoming a racialized reality of climate change will prove to be an unprecedented challenge. I am honored to introduce our distinguished panelists who will enlighten us on their perspectives and professional work regarding the climate challenges we are and will continue to face. Joining us virtually, please welcome Dr. Marcus King, Professor of the Practice in Environment and International Affairs at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service, and author of a newly released book, Weaponizing Water, Water Stress and Islamic Extremist Violence in Africa and the Middle East. Please welcome Dr. King. I would also like to introduce Dr. Michael Mlinar, current ambassador of Slovakia to the United Nations and newly appointed Assistant Secretary General and Deputy Executive Director of UN Habitat. Entering his newly appointed role with UN Habitat later this spring, Dr. Mlinar will help facilitate the mission of the organization to promote socially and environmentally sustainable cities and agriculture. Please. Next, I would like to introduce our third panelist, Professor Diego Osorio, academic researcher and former senior advisor in climate security, conflict, and peace at Global Affairs Canada, who is a recent contributor to the launching of the NATO Center of Excellence on Climate Change and Security. And finally, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Cheryl T. Luxing virtually, Professor of Sociology and Department Chair at Toronto Metropolitan University. Her areas of expertise are focused on environmental justice and the racialization of the climate crisis, along with developing community-based solutions to counteract the social and economic inequalities exacerbated by climate change. Our panelists will shortly begin sharing their presentations, then I will proceed with a couple of questions to initiate dialogue amongst the panelists before opening to the audience for a Q&A session. Thank you, and please join me in welcoming our first presentation, Dr. Cheryl T. Luxing.
So it's unfortunate that I'm not able to be there with you because of a storm that's just about to come into Toronto, so I had to return home. But I am a racialized settler, and it's important to acknowledge that this is unceded Indigenous land. If you can go to the next slide, please. So, as many of us know, in terms of the problem of climate change, the burden is going to be felt by those who've had the least, have done the least in terms of the consequences of addressing. Sorry, I'm no longer seeing my slides for some reason. So sub-Saharan countries in Africa have contributed the least to producing greenhouse gases and are set to be among those who will suffer the most from climate change. The World Bank estimates by 2050, 86 million Africans will be forced to migrate due to climate-induced change. Next slide, please. For example, West Africa, and specifically Nigeria, which is the area that I've been interested in, is dealing with depleted soil conditions and deforestation due to the reduced rainfall in the context of ethnic tensions. As a result of that, what is happening is that Nigeria is now one of the countries by which majority of the African immigrants coming to Canada right now are of Nigerian descent since 2016. However, there is no data to determine how much migration from Nigeria or other African nations are due to climate change. Next slide, please. Different patterns of environmental problems are likely to trigger different patterns of climate migration. So as profiled in this diagram, migration itself is a fairly complex issue that relates to a wide variety of factors, including health, livelihood, food security. But climate-induced migration, as an issue, the role of race and racism has not been adequately understood in terms of the intersection with these multiple causes of climate-induced patterns. Next slide, please. There's been a variety of publications that have come out recently so that the issue of climate displacement and climate migration has become an important issue. But the loudest arguments, particularly those coming out of COP and the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, are framing climate migrants in two dominant ways. First of all, they're talking about the need for the international community to revise the Refugee Convention. So the Refugee Convention was established in 1951, and right now it is not possible for anybody who is leaving their country due to climate issues to claim to be refugees. The second main way that if the issue of climate displacement and climate migrants is being framed is as an environmental problem. So in a lot of contexts, high carbon emissions are being seen as the issue, and that the countries that are most responsible are being asked to reduce their emission targets. Next slide, please. Where I'm located in Canada, the federal government and non-state actors are also taking up the predominantly migration concern. And in this slide, if you guys are able to see it, a lot of the talk uses discourse such as the concern for the influx of climate refugees. And Canada, since 2018, has actually signed an international agreement that increases its obligation to take in climate migrants. This agreement is called the Global Compacts for Safe and Orderly Refugee Migration. The big thing that I'm presenting to you today, in keeping with the theme of the conference, is to say that these are race-neutral, colorblind approaches to addressing racialized climate migrants. Race is seen to not be a factor in terms of how policy is taking up the issue or the dominant discourses circulating that it's encouraging how society is seeing climate migrants. The assumption is then that all of those factors that are important to migration or that are important to climate change are being seen to treat everybody the exact same way. So lines like the influx of climate migrants that raises concerns about what is it going to mean when there's going to be a large movement of people coming predominantly from a variety of countries in the global south, including the Nigerians that I started off talking about. There is not the discussion then or the practical action to build in place the specific supports that will be needed to address these distinct migrants and refugees. Next slide, please. So to contribute to the discussion that we're having today at the conference, I've been really drawn to theorists such as Andrew Baldwin and his work on climate change. And he's bringing a really different framing to the issue. And he's saying that this is not just a problem of migration that we're going to be dealing with, or in the Canadian context where we're concerned about how many are possibly going to be coming to the borders and whether or not we need to simply change our immigration policies to be more inclusive. But what Baldwin gets at, and the work that I'm interested in taking up, is the crisis of humanism. The crisis of humanism, which is why race and racism is significant, is that these are political issues that are not being positioned as human rights concerns. Humanism, as we may be familiar with, has taken two dominant forms. So if we go back to the Enlightenment understanding of humanism, this is very much reified the white Western male. And as part of that, the racial hierarchy is set in place. Notions of humanism have influenced a lot of policies and then have justified countries in the global south or racialized people from being excluded or properly addressed in terms of policy frameworks. Again, climate change and climate migrants then are not part of the issue. If we shift from Enlightenment humanism to some of the forms of humanism that are now being influenced by current environmentalism, you can see that post-humanist movements are seeking to question what it means to be human in a slightly different way. Now they're looking at what it means to be human from the perspective of the planetary crisis. And post-humanists are aligning themselves with the critiques of the Anthropocene and basically saying, okay, well, we want to move away from being anthropocentric. And as a result, the post-humanists are saying, okay, the best way to start to frame policy and discourses is to say that we're all interconnected, in keeping with an ecological perspective. This in itself is fine, but again, as part of how humanism is being positioned, the human rights concerns and the perspective on race, and race as an analytical category, is taking a back seat. Post-humanism is taking a colorblind position or a racial neutrality. And by being racially neutral, what we have is that whiteness continues to be unquestioned when we start to dig deeper into looking at the situation and the needs of racialized climate migrants. Next slide, please. So in my work and my thinking and those sorts of things as both an academic and someone who's hoping to influence policy is to suggest that climate migration framing and policy needs to incorporate a view to racialized humanism. What this may look like, drawing off of particular theorists, and there's work now positioning particularly the Black Anthropocene. And this becomes a helpful way to look at particularly African migrants coming to places like Canada, and to see the fact that the inhumanity of how policy has positioned them in the past is very much sort of linked to the colonization framework, and that the coloniality has positioned racialized bodies in harm in the same way that the geographies of extraction and the climate change risks that they encounter are all tied together. So Catherine Yusuf's work on the Black Anthropocene is but one example of a theorist who's now beginning to sort of recognize that, yes, while we can question the anthropocentrism that is part of causing climate change, it does not mean that we don't need to have particular social variables in place in order to link climate migrants and issues of race in the way in which it matters. Next slide, please. What I would like to highlight, just in closing in terms of my thoughts here today, is an initiative that's in place in Canada that I think is kind of promising and will potentially allow the Canadian government and other non-state players to do some things that are somewhat creative. So in Canada, our political system situates a lot of the governance within the Canadian House of Commons. And right now, there's a bill, Bill C-226, that's entitled the National Strategy Respecting Environmental Racism and Environmental Justice Act. Somewhat similar to the environmental justice policy that you have in the US. But because this specifically embeds a view to systemic racism within the environmental policy, this is going to require, once it gets passed, so this has gone through a couple of readings now in the House of Commons, the federal environmental minister to develop a strategy to assess and prevent and address environmental racism. And I think that this type of policy nationally in Canada will become a framework to treat race analytically in terms of climate migration, and to start to resist the coloniality that environmentalism and refugee policy has. This will also provide a new understanding for the migrants that I'm particularly interested in from sub-Saharan Africa in the legal and policy frameworks, to see climate-induced migration as being multi-causal and heterogeneous, and that includes racism at its core. Thank you.
Now please join me in welcoming Dr. Marcus King as he shares his presentation.
Thank you very much. I'm really glad to be back at Tufts, even virtually. I got my master's and my PhD from the Fletcher School, so I'm sorry I wasn't able to join you due to some other scheduling issues. I wanted to begin by talking about environmental racism, also known as ecological apartheid. So this is a form of institutionalized racism that was leading to landfills, incinerators, and hazardous waste disposal being disproportionately placed within communities of color in the United States. But it also refers to the history of excluding people of color from leadership in ecological movements. The term and concept is rooted, of course, in the U.S. African-American faith tradition and also the civil rights movement. It's a fairly new historical concept along with environmentalism itself, which emerged in the 1960s. Environmental racism was coined in 1982 by Benjamin Chavis, who is a previous director of the United Church of Christ and the Commission on Racial Justice, which, as I had said, had influence from the civil rights movement. Environmental racism is easy to recognize in the United States by looking at the news, from publicity surrounding, for example, the contamination of water supplies in Flint, Michigan, and that impact on the African American community. There are also climate change specific examples dealing with U.S. indigenous communities. They include things like relocation of indigenous villages in coastal Alaska due to sea level rise, and relocation of indigenous people from the St. Charles Island group off of Louisiana, New Orleans. But my area is international affairs, and it's a bit subtler maybe to understand how environmental racism has pervaded the regime to address climate change. So as stated earlier, the environmental racism is related to toxic waste. On the international level, there's another concept which I would call toxic waste colonialism. My book chapter on the transboundary environmental negotiations was written as a grad student in 2000 at Fletcher. So this was the first time I encountered this issue. The name of my article was Harder Than Physics, Negotiating an International Regime to Limit Transboundary Consequences of Nuclear Waste. It was my first publication, and it set me on a trajectory toward eventually getting my PhD and a career in academia later focused on environmental security. So in that chapter, I described how Taiwan was negotiating an agreement for disposal of hazardous waste in the Marshall Islands. So hold the thought about the Marshall Islands for a few minutes, and I'll come back to them later in the context of climate change. And so this paper outlined a framework to extend protections under the Basel Convention for toxic waste and expand that to nuclear waste. The distinguishable difference between toxic waste colonialism and environmental racism is that toxic waste colonialism is the practice of targeting poor communities of color in developing nations for waste disposal and also experimentation with risky technologies. So toxic colonialism can be seen as a micro, as it focuses on a specific area or group of people. Environmental racism, more largely, can be seen as macro, as it examines the issues of at a larger and worldwide scale. So history has shown that the overall impact of toxic waste dumping in developing nations has been devastating and severely compromised all aspects of human health. A case study done in 2010 by the UN Environmental Program looked at excessive incidents of cancer, unknown diseases, miscarriages of pregnant women, and child deformation in Somalia. But Somalia is a country that's already been racked by famine, caused in part by climate change-induced drought and related famine, among other factors. So in some instances in Somalia, payments were not only the thing exchanged between developed and developing nations over toxic waste, but also Somali warring parties used hazardous and highly toxic waste in exchange for ammunition. They accepted it in exchange for ammunition. So despite the Basel Treaty, which prohibits the illegal dumping of toxic waste worldwide, millions of tons of toxic waste and hazardous material continue to move legally and illegally from richer countries to poorer countries each year. So besides toxic waste colonialism, another form of colonialism is eco-colonialism. And this is where the ecological footprint that measures the biologically productive area needed to provide everything that people demand from nature. In many countries, the global north, the ecological footprint exceeds biocapacity, or the capacity of ecosystems to regenerate what people demand from those surfaces, those ecological footprints. So environmental insecurity then, which I teach about, is the way that the impacts of environmental degradation on the global north's larger ecological footprint then affects people in the global south who are already subject to underdevelopment. So in short, ecological colonialism is when northern countries extend their ecological footprint into the global south. Of course, this can cause environmental insecurity and lack of resilience. So therefore, the disproportionate impacts of climate change on these countries is an example. It's not characterized by the direct extraction of resources like historical colonialism, but it is colonialism. Eco-colonialism changes the geopolitical boundaries in a virtual sense and causes environmental insecurities among those who are then encroached upon. The regime to address the impacts of climate change then can be seen through a lens of ecological colonialism, and I'll explain more. So my first exposure to the climate-related problems faced by small island states was when I was on the US delegation for negotiation of the Kyoto Protocol. My assignment therein was to be a liaison with the small island states. And I first saw that the asymmetrical relationship between the United States and other delegations was reflected by the fact that I was one of about 50 people on the US delegation, whereas my negotiating partners from the small island states had 2 or 3 people for their entire delegations. So there was a huge capacity gap. So in the context of addressing sea level rise, which was the major climate analog that we were dealing with, Pacific Islanders who inhabited the microstates are discriminated against due to a lack of structural power in this realist-based international system in which the climate change regime is then based on. So My thesis then is that the lack of structural power is rooted, among other things, in the racist legacy of what we would call normal colonialism. In fact, the term Pacific Islanders itself refers to those hailing from islands in the Pacific Ocean that were colonized by Portuguese, Spaniards, French, British, but also the United States itself. So the United States, looking critically, has been complicit in environmental racism against Pacific Islander communities. And this has manifested itself in what scholars refer to as a warfare ecology. So by warfare ecology, I mean the impacts of war, preparation for war, and post-conflict reconstruction on the environment. The military activity, including the development of nuclear weapons complex, are manifestations of the warfare ecology, again tinged with racism in the Pacific Islands. The United States conducted 105 atmospheric and underwater tests of nuclear weapons in the Marshall Islands from about 1946 to the early 60s. And many of these islands were part of what was known as the Pacific Proving Grounds, and they're still contaminated with nuclear fallout. So other nations concerned in the Pacific region, such as Vanuatu, were concerned that the entire region would become a toxic waste disposal ground. And the health effects of these atmospheric tests continue to linger today among the populations. Other weapons, such as chemical and biological weapons, were also incinerated in a place called Johnson Atoll by the United States until the year 2000. So what does this have to do with climate change? Well, I look at climate change as an existential threat to these island states. The nature of sea level rise indeed is a weapon of mass destruction. It can be seen as a weapon of mass destruction against small island states because they basically have a guarantee of being flooded out of existence eventually. Even by the end of the century, the way that they will be affected is almost analogous then to the nuclear weapons, into the nuclear weapons legacy of testing in the Pacific itself. So there's a well-developed nuclear arms control regime among the world's nuclear states anyway, but not one that actually guarantees, there's not a regime around climate change in terms of viewing it as a weapon of mass destruction when it's associated with guaranteed impacts that are existential to these small island states. I was struck by some words by Bill Clinton, who visited the Conference of the Parties in 2015 in Montreal, where he had said climate change is more remote than terrorism, but more profound as a threat in the future. It's the only thing we face today that has the power to remove the conditions of civilized societies. So my book was mentioned, and my research is published in 2 books that interrogates this quote from Bill Clinton, finding that neither climate change nor terrorism are in fact remote factors, in that actually a significant relationship exists between climate change and terrorism in many places, including Somalia. In Africa, losses and damages are also what's being experienced with an escalation of global warming. This has already caused environmental migration, but it's a question in the Pacific, in the context of the Pacific, whether race has played a factor in the unwillingness of countries such as Australia and New Zealand to accept climate migrants from adjacent small island states, or even in the context of Africa and Southern Europe's resistance against climate migrants coming from Africa. So this can be seen in the context of climate justice. So what can be done in terms of climate justice to address the impacts of climate change on colonized people, both in Africa and small island states? Recalling that climate justice is based on the fact that such a small amount of global emissions generated by either Africa or the small island states is actually only between 1% and 5% of global emissions. So there are 2 things that I would recommend relating to the climate change negotiations in the Paris Accords. The first would be to increase climate finance and to also address the loss and damage provisions in the Accords that were spoken about in 27 and now are an issue salient going into COP28. So in my opinion, the international climate negotiations of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change are too focused on mitigation because the idea of climate change impacts are already baked in to the global system, even at a 1.5 degree level, which is what the treaty aspires to. But most peer-reviewed science would agree that even the 1.5 degree increase is extremely unlikely at this point. So what could then be important is climate finance. Climate finance is simply an increase in funding for adaptation, and I think this would be a step in the right direction. It refers to local, national, and transnational funding that can be from public, private sector, or multilateral development banks to support both mitigation and adaptation actions that would address climate change in small island states and other vulnerable nations. Losses and damages, this is an idea that's now under debate and also referred to by some as climate reparations. And climate reparations as an idea has obvious intersections with climate and racial justice as well. So this racial dynamic, I would say, is playing itself out in the context of this debate over the concept of losses and damages that's now in the Paris Accords. So losses and damages from climate change are unavoidable and they are unequally distributed. But more funding for adaptation cannot prevent all the losses and damages that are being experienced. And even the most affected countries by climate change are experiencing these damages and losses that are disproportionate to their contribution to global emissions. So despite what I would call the recalcitrance of the United States and some other more wealthy nations, a loss and damages fund was finally agreed to during COP27 back in November in Sharm el-Sheikh. I would note, however, that binding emission targets were not achieved, which was the central purpose of the treaty, as I had said. While the negotiation text, however, recognized the need for financial support from a variety of sources, no decisions have been made on A, who should pay for the fund, B, where the money will come from, and C, exactly which countries will benefit. So again, this issue will be carried as one of the most contentious issues onto the negotiating table during the next round of climate talks, and I hope there's progress. So to conclude, this fund is an important step toward environmental justice, a response to eco-colonialism, but it's a question of whether enough funding gets allocated by the most developing nations. How this happens and the operational parameters of the new loss and damages fund will then be reflecting the efficacy of a global commitment to Pacific Islanders and also to Africans who've experienced both structural and environmental racism. So denial of these climate reparations, much like denial of reparations for slavery, is a familiar problem, both influenced by colonial and racist undercurrents that have manifested themselves in the United States against African Americans and indigenous people, and in Africa and the small island states in the Pacific against the darker skinned people that live in those regions. So thank you very much for your patience with my fairly long presentation here, and I look to the opportunity to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. King. And now please welcome Ambassador Mlinar as he discusses his work at the UN.
Thank you. Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to join you this morning. Fletcher and Tufts University has always been close to my heart. We have been working with different branches of Fletcher and Tufts University for a good number of years, so it's always a pleasure to accept invitations to its events. I'm grateful to both Dr. Marcus and Dr. Cheryl for really setting the stage extremely well for the different aspects of the topic. it makes my job a little bit easier, and obviously I intend to focus primarily on the international context and on the UN context, some of which has already been mentioned, but I'll try to be a little bit more practical or focused on some of the specific work in the field to the extent possible. But indeed, the term environmental racism emerged in the US, as has already been mentioned. But international environmental racism arises when a government or corporation pursues policies that disparately impact racial minorities in particular. Conscious intent to continue racial subordination is not necessary. Any action that has negative, predictable consequences for racial minorities can be an act of environmental racism, just if we focus on the term itself. And indeed, in recent years, it's been a major issue, and it is also the phenomenon of the transboundary movement of hazardous wastes, in particular, that is a specific challenge that we need to address. Governments and corporations, usually from developed nations, create hazardous waste in their country as a byproduct of manufacturing, and pay or in a different way motivate developing countries to dispose of the waste. This is certainly a policy that needs to be changed, that needs to be stopped, and needs to be prevented. But it has obviously different dimensions. The UN has focused on the issue, as has already been mentioned by Dr. Marcus, through the Basel Convention, which actually is the Basel Convention on the control of transboundary movements of hazardous waste and their disposal. And it was already brokered at the UN back in 1989, so it's been a while, as you can see. And we have 190 countries that are states parties to the convention. In fact, the only member states missing are Haiti and the United States. But it goes beyond that, because basically it focuses on preventing or focuses on management of the shipments of hazardous waste between OECD and non-OECD parties to the convention. And even though, for example, the United States is not a state party of the convention, it also this is also covered because it prohibits any non-party to the convention, including the United States, from trading hazardous waste with a Basel party, for example, Indonesia, unless they had previous bilateral or multilateral agreements in place. So this is just to give you a bit further context of the treaty, of the convention. There is an important addition to the Basel Convention, and it is the Bamako Convention on the ban of the import into Africa and the control of transboundary movement and management of hazardous wastes within Africa. In short, it is called the Bamako Convention, and it specifically focuses on the African countries, whereby already in the Basel Convention there is a provision that actually encourages member states to conclude regional, bilateral, multilateral agreements for hazardous wastes. And this is exactly what the Bamako Convention does, focuses on Africa and the hazardous wastes. What are actually the causes of international environmental racism? That has already been well mentioned by Dr. Marcus. In fact, first, it was caused by more stringent environmental regulations and increased cost of waste treatment and disposal, but increased public attention to this issue and scarcity of disposal facilities, as well as stricter environmental rules, obviously lead to increased disposal costs, and these things are then closely related. The process was also enabled by the need for fiscal relief, so to say, rooted in a long history of colonialism and contemporary loan arrangements that have also already been mentioned between developing and developed countries. And it then potentially leads to some arrangements or some trade-offs, like in the case of Somalia. But there is one other specific case that I wanted to mention, and it is actually the toxic dumping of e-waste. And according to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, the UNODC, each year an estimated 94,000 tons of e-waste worth about $95 million, much of which contains heavy metals and other toxins, makes its way from Europe and the United States, particularly in Africa, and actually specifically to, for example, Nigeria and Ghana. And when we speak of e-waste, I mean stuff such as the discarded computers, television sets, mobile phones, microwave ovens, and other such appliances that are past their useful lives. And I'm sure you can easily relate to a culture of replacing old appliances very quickly with new ones, and often you are actually discouraged from even having them repaired because it's often cheaper just to buy a new one. But you know, we should realize that it actually leads to other related challenges. Still more worrying is the fact that even when this waste arrives in African countries, for example, it is stripped of raw materials mainly by young children working in poisoned landfills. The children inhale toxic fumes as the electronics are incinerated, in stark contrast to what is obtainable in countries where this waste originates. For example, in the UK or US, electronic waste is required to be appropriately recycled and is barred from incineration and landfills. What we need in this context is improving e-waste governance and also better norms related to entrepreneurship in this particular area. I also wanted to remind you of 30th of March, which we will be actually reaching at the end of this month. 30th of March is the International Day of Zero Waste. And every year there is a whole lot of initiatives focused on particularly preventing such negative phenomena as I have already mentioned. And in fact, this month, on the 30th of March, we will be organizing a high-level meeting in the UN General Assembly precisely on that. And two agencies, the UN Environmental Programme and UN Habitat, are actually working on an initiative, on a resolution that would specifically target this area. Well, in terms of general problems with tackling international environmental racism, there are some key challenges that I just want to highlight briefly. Lack of experience, then problems with detection, also issues related to toxic waste definition, because unfortunately we have no universally agreed definition for toxic waste, which, as you can imagine, leads to some actors, whether it is governments or entrepreneurs or others, taking advantage of the loopholes or taking advantage of the gaps that are created. But of course there is other practical work, as I have mentioned, that already is in place and that we need to continue focusing on. In addition to the enforcement mechanisms, waste classification or reporting, there is also the so-called e-waste global monitor. It actually really serves well in ensuring that we have appropriate statistics, we have reliable data at the national level, but also at the international level, and that we are able to address some of the specific cases, because often it is through focusing on specific cases or publicizing them that we can not only take care of the specific issues, but we can increase the advocacy and outreach and hopefully prevent the same from happening again. It is also important to continue monitoring the trends, and there is a whole bunch of reports which, for example, reveal that the volume of transboundary movement of wastes increased from 9.3 to 14.4 million tons. Actually 97% of hazardous waste generated in a country stays in that country, with some exceptions. So we see some admirable improvements that we can document in many countries, but it still doesn't mean that the fight and the challenge, the issue is over. Well, as you have heard, I will soon, on the 10th of April, be taking up my new position as Deputy Executive Director of UN Habitat, which is the UN agency specifically focusing on human settlements, on housing, infrastructure, on sustainable cities, urbanization, and importantly on the cooperation with local and regional governments. UN Habitat has its headquarters in Nairobi, Kenya, but it operates with projects in 91 countries and has a project portfolio of about $200 million a year. So this is, in a nutshell, what I am actually heading into. And I wanted to just briefly share with you one or two specific projects that UN Habitat actually has in this particular area. One of them is called Waste-Wise Cities. It was launched to address the increasing global waste management crisis. Waste from homes, markets, businesses and institutions is often thrown on the streets, in drains, dumped next to communities, or openly burnt. These are certainly cases which are not unique. Not only does this make cities unsightly and unattractive for tourists or investors, but more importantly, of course, it has a huge impact on our environment, but it can also lead to flooding, air and water pollution, diseases, in particular respiratory diseases or other health problems. So there is this particular initiative that works along 12 specific indicators, principles, how to manage solid waste in cities in particular. Because I don't know if you realize that actually 70% of global carbon is actually generated in the cities. So, involving our cities, in particular in developing countries, in these solutions is absolutely critical. And of course, I'm sure I don't need to also remind you of the fact that the process of urbanization is still very very much speeding up, especially in developing countries, where you continue seeing huge movements of population from the rural areas into urban areas, where they seek better living conditions, better jobs, access to education or to health, and many other factors like that. But of course, the flip side of the coin is the various challenges that we then face. Another good example of a project implemented by UN Habitat is a course, a training course that helps stakeholders with skills building in waste management. It was launched online in 2022, first in French on municipal solid waste management system assessment methodology. Later it became also available in English. It is called From Data to Tangible Impact, Achieving Waste SDGs by 2030. So this is specifically focused on African clean cities and building awareness among city leaders, but also and in particular young people in the cities to focus on the issue of waste. Often it is indeed young people or young champions that on the cities level are very actively engaged. I can share with you another example of a project, a very successful project from Colombia, where it was necessary to address street crime or street, if you will, insecurities of different natures, and it is through youth monitors and offering small job opportunities to young people that the city, together with UN Habitat, was able to turn around the situation and really create a situation whereby the young people would effectively prevent their fathers or their older brothers in particular from engaging in some of the typical street and municipal crime activities. This is not specifically related to waste or to environment, but obviously these things often are interrelated. I think I should leave it at that, and of course I will be more than happy to answer any specific questions related to some of the projects that I have mentioned, or in general our work at the United Nations, including in the General Assembly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Molina. And now to you, Professor Osorio.
Well, good morning, and thank you all for your attention. As somebody who has different institutional attachments, I have to start by saying that the contents and opinions provided in this presentation reflect only my personal views and do not engage in any way His Majesty the King in Right of Canada or any instance of the community. The second element is I would like to recognize that we are on colonized Wampanoag and Massachusetts tribe traditional territory, and I want to just make sure that we're aware of it. I will be talking to you about the dimension of climate change and conflict and how racism plays a role here. It's important to understand that climate change is now certainly, as President Clinton mentioned and Professor King just highlighted that it is a very much existential term, but it has many subsets within that. We have climate change and energy and the transition. Is an important thing, geopolitical implications, is a matter that concerns everyone. Then we have climate change and biodiversity, climate change and desertification. We have conventions and instruments to deal with it. We are trying to catch up and building the necessary institutional networks and institutional frameworks that are needed to address this issue. But perhaps it's not fast enough. That's one thing. And then within all that big universe of different elements related to climate change, we have one that is concerning and is very much shaping a lot of the thinking on many levels, particularly in the sector of security. It's climate change and conflict. Climate change and conflict because we know that we live in a world that is very much a big fishbowl. You know, we're all here and we all interact and interdependent. And we are carrying on with a way of using the planet that is leading to having climate change, destruction of resources, finite resources, and then at the end of the day we have to deal with a planet that might not be able to sustain this type, speed, and content of the kind of uses that we have to. At one point it will lead to conflict. It is leading to conflict. We have many conflicts that are connected to that. And the issue with climate change and conflict is that we are still in a debate between whether there is a real causality or not. Everybody says climate change is a multiplier. There is a lot of academic and policy debate about that. But one thing for sure is that for the practitioner, for the people that have to take decisions, that they have to shape priorities, there is clearly a relationship. And whether we can have a peer-reviewed paper on proven causalities or not is besides the point. We have a problem. It's a huge problem. And the nature of climate change and the implications of conflict is probably going to influence the way we will have to develop new tools and new ways of addressing this issue. Typical frameworks of mediation, typical frameworks of conflict and management, planning, forecasting, analysis might not give us the right picture about what's happening and what's going to hit us, or what is hitting us already. Think, for instance, of Afghanistan, a big geopolitical security issue, etc., etc. You have many layers of that. But what if I tell you that if we had taken climate change and security as one of the key factors in the understanding of Afghanistan, we have given you a different picture? We have given you a different sequencing of how factors need to be addressed. We have given you a whole different picture of how the place works and how we should address it. If you think of Haiti, failed state, major security situation, we see it as a side. We address Haiti or we don't address Haiti. But from the perspective of climate change and the implications in terms of what carries for societies, think of that analogy. We are in a fishbowl. But in a fishbowl, there's one part of the water that gets dirty or gets used or something happens. Everybody in the fishbowl suffers. It's the same thing here. If we address, if we look, if we analyze Haiti from the perspective of climate change and security, we might have a very different picture. We might have a different prioritization. And we might have a different framework of analysis that will take us into solutions that might be escaping us at the moment. As an important thing. We have discussed about racism here, and I think Professor Corey and Professor Marcus have well established the parameters and the intellectual underpinnings of what's happening with racism in the context of climate change. And I concur 100%. I will just use those elements to say one thing. We have an architecture of power that has shaped our society being where we live, and the globalized society that we are part of. Whether it's different ideological elements, we have an architecture of power that shapes everything. And that architecture of power is proven effective in the short term to allow those who want to maintain their power to get away with what they want to do. And that's the nature of things. I'm not advocating for a global revolution or anything like that. I'm just saying that is the current situation. But the same thinking, the same approach is taking us to a situation in which this particular issue of climate change and security is going to bite us. Why? Because we are in a situation in which the nature of climate change is already past the preventive stage. We're still fighting and hoping that we're going to maintain it in the 1.5 transition. I don't want to be pessimistic, but I think that's very unlikely. So we now have to prepare how to live, coexist, maintain and thrive in a less than ideal situation. In a less than an ideal situation, we have a problem in terms of how we're going to manage resources, how we're going to share a smaller pie, how we're going to live in that smaller pie. And if we have an architecture of power in which racism is a big element, imagine all the cascade effects in terms of who gets attention, what priorities get the top, who decides what, who gets sent on the evacuation lane faster, and all this. Interconnectedness is a key element in human society, in any society, in any group, in the biosphere. And that interconnectedness means that what happens there is going to happen here. And that is essential because we need to take that into account. So, if we go back to the nature of the architectural power in which racism is doing that, let's just say that that is an undermining of the key elements of a potential solution for all of us. Racism is actually an auto-induced hitting yourself in the foot. Because if you don't feel that you need to address racism and colonialism and all these inequalities in the system for what they imply for others, in this particular case, it's going to have a major implication for you. My reasoning on this is based on what I've seen in terms of what happened on the ground. If we are not able to address the issues of climate change and control, in terms of building better governance, in terms of rendering the system a little bit more aware of that, in terms of creating better response that for at least once moves from the solution and containment to the prevention, we're going to have problems of the type of scale that I don't think President Clinton's quote will actually really address it. And it is essential that we are able to do something because climate change is the one existential crisis, not that we have faced many, but is one for which technically we have all the needed technologies to address. Socially, we have all the elements at hand. It's a matter of governance. It's a matter of actually getting together and actually addressing. So it's not just wishful thinking I'm trying to convey here. It is a real realization. If you think of the Marshall Plan, right? The Marshall Plan was about addressing a situation in a part of Europe because if we didn't, then there would be major repercussions on other parts of the world. And basically, you had skin in the game, and it was in your own benefit to put all that money and make sure things would stay in a certain angle of the political spectrum over there. Well, the same thing needs to happen in terms of climate change. If we don't address those inequalities, they are going to have major implications in our own society. Security-wise, for instance, if we talk about Haiti, it's a country that's so dear to me because I worked there several times, it's not an isolation. And Haiti is not just a failed state and a security issue. It is a glimpse of the kind of climate change and security crisis that we're going to have in the future. Many at once, concurrent, and without an end. So what are we going to do in this situation? How are we going to prioritize between bad and worse? Between an emergency here and an emergency there? So think of the Marshall Plan and think of resilience. Why resilience? Because at the end of the day, no factor, no institution, no government is going to be able to have a direct and a proactive engagement on one crisis and then have the luxury of dealing with another problem. It's all over the place. And the only way to have a real engagement is to have something in which societies are capable of addressing this. And if you want that, that means you have to reduce inequality. If you want to reduce inequality, if you want to increase the resilience of society, you have to tackle racism. And so, it's not just a matter of being congruent in terms of what it should be, in terms of the idealistic perspective of how a society should improve. It's everybody's interest. It's a matter of national security. It's a matter of survival for each country to try to address this. For once, it turns out that the thinking of the Marshall Plan connects with resilience, and resilience can be climate change. I'm going to mention three key principles here, three key points I want to make. Think of this whole language of migration, climate change, refugees. Clearly, the UN Convention is going to address this. And they will, eventually. You're going to have to tackle that and have to change it. But there are many reasons why they don't necessarily address it in terms of the climate change refugee. There are political implications and many other things. Anyway, the whole thing is, it will happen, it's not that way. But think about the word migration. Migration implies agency. It means the person decides at one point, for whatever reason, to move from A to B. If you think of displacement, you have no agency in your term. And people are being displaced, mostly internally, but increasingly internationally. And in that context, it means that we have a situation in which those who are affected have no agency. Now remember from another Georgetown professor who had made the argument that we need to have human dignity as the center of global governance. Agency is two things. Human dignity is two things. Agency, the ability to decide, and two, the ability to be recognized. We know that with racism, we kind of erase you. And if we take it with agency, we basically take the capacity of people to be somehow autonomous in the capacity. So what happens here? We need to figure out a way in which climate change is properly addressed as an interdisciplinary and interinstitutional. Climate change, as it stands now, in the context of security, is seen as something that we will have to tackle in places at a certain time in a certain way. It's internal. It's essential that we address that. The second element is that the institutional framework needs to be adapted. And this is it's not just a matter of changing conventions and getting the specialized agencies in the UN and different governments to act in a different way. It's to really understand what is at play. This is a matter for the Security Council. This is not a matter for just specialized agencies. It's a matter of top prioritization because it is an existential threat. In that context, we have to look at what happens when we have societies that have a degree of resilience that is being affected by inequality. We have societies that lead to problems, that have problems, and that don't have the mechanisms for their own people to take care of it. The environmental issue of justice is key because it's related to the principles of intersectionality. Everything that has been mentioned in terms of what needs to be done to address racism in one context, copy-paste and apply to the issue of climate change. We need to have a new revamped approach. And we also need to look at the issues of governance. We have an international governance that is not at speed and is not meeting the necessary targets that need to be addressed to be able to respond to this situation. It's still not too late, but once we're going to have the emergency upon us, we won't have the time to think of it. And one proposal I would like to make is that we need to frame it, yes, with human rights and with all the conventions we have in place, but we need a directive, we need a guiding principle that is encompassing and that gives us the sense of celerity that is needed to be in place here. And I would say that principle is human dignity. If you have need for action and you still don't have the specific human right or the specific convention or the specific parameters, well, at the end of the day, the equation comes down to what is the needed thing to do if you have to address it from the principle of human dignity. What is the essential thing to act? What is the essential element that you need to tackle? And this is important because when we prioritize the integration of human rights and social justice into climate change and security policies, it gives us a whole different set of secrets, a whole different sense of approach. I will finish by saying the following. The future can be what we make of it. We as humanity have made mistakes, and what we had in the past is not going to be what we have in the future. But we have the option of making it a still livable future or something less than that. And it's not apocalyptic. I mean, change is what happens. You know? We all moving from one direction to the other. We might even come up with a better humanity in the future in the face of these deficiencies and problems. But certainly we need to do it thinking that equality and the respect for human dignity is at the center of that new building of global government. And when we apply all that nice architecture on the idea of climate change and security, it's going to give us a set of priorities, institutional requirements, and measures to be taken at every level that are not necessarily in the pipeline level. So I will be happy to take your questions and engage with this. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Osorio, and thank you to all of our panelists for sharing their insights today. Because of time, I'm going to immediately open it up to the audience for discussion. If no one has a question right now, I will start and initiate dialogue via some questions I've prepared. But If anyone would like to ask a question, please either stand up, feel free to go to the microphone. Yeah. No, you can, yep, address everyone.
Hello, good morning. First of all, thank you so much for sharing a little bit of knowledge with us. It was a really enlightening presentation. I'm Sérgio. I'm a Brazilian student for international relations, and okay, I'm not gonna address specifically to any speaker, so I would like to know everyone's opinion about it. So after some research about climate-induced migrations, I realized that the term climate refugee is not officially recognized by most of the states. Even the UNHCR itself does not officially recognize the category. So I'd like to know, how do you think the legal recognition of the category climate refugee by the UN and other international organizations, could affect the securitization agenda of countries in the global north, especially countries in the European Union, and how do you think it would affect BIPOC people, especially from the global south, in the next years?
Just one thing. The Refugee Convention is a good scapegoat for a lot of the problems, and it was intended that way, but it was framed in terms of the world that we had in 1950. So right now, if you have a reason and you can prove it, you can be a refugee, and then countries that are signatories to the convention will act on that. How you actually get to claim a refugee and all the things, there are many restrictions, but that's the idea. So you have a claim, and somebody decides that your claim is legitimate, and then you're entitled to be a refugee. If you take into the equation the whole idea of climate change, so when did climate change hit you? Or who in the group of climate change tortured you? The language, the narrative, the institutional framework is not prepared to deal with this kind of situation. Because one thing about climate change is that it's cognitively diffuse. It's everywhere and it's nowhere. And humans, we are not capable of dealing with this kind of thing. Right? We need to have a face to do something. And so it will take a lot of institutional engineering to address that. And how will that address the situation? Well, right now, different governments bend over backwards to have different types of definition. Migrants, displacement, economic migrants. So people that are risking their lives to cross the Mediterranean or to go from Central America or try to escape Haiti, you can give them many analyses, many angles, many perspectives. At the end of the day, they are being forced to escape from something. If you are able to adapt the legal regime of refugees to that, it's going to be a major Herculean effort to try to square all these different dimensions. Because at the end of the day, you have to take into account. So it's a challenge, and perhaps we need to have different approaches other than just the Refugee Convention. I think if you focus on resilience and the capacity of people to face the problems where they are, we might have a better resolution.
If any other panelists would like to answer, please go ahead.
One of my points and say that I agree that resilience is going to be the key, and I'm happy to see that resilience is being sort of inculcated into the climate negotiations now, and so that just relates back to climate finance. And so if countries are going to meet their commitments to funding under climate finance, I'd really like to see that money shifted more toward adaptation at this point and a little less toward mitigation. And in doing so, this will help build resilience in countries where problems may be able to be solved on the ground there before the migration would take place. And of course, it's multi-causal. That many people will move because of poverty, and poverty has many causes. And I really appreciated and admired the phrase of climate change being cognitively diffuse, and it is very hard to put together the causality. But building resilience is a win-win scenario in any part of the world, and so I think and hope that the regime is moving in that direction.
I will also add a few thoughts to that. I fully agree with what has already been said. Just to add that, in fact, indeed, the securitization of the agenda is something that that we observe on a daily basis. That's one clear trend. Another area of attention, especially of some of the small island states that really face a direct threat of being underwater or disappearing due to, for example, the rise of ocean levels, is seeking support, of course, technical support. This is an important issue, but also seeking clarification of certain legal aspects of the situation. So there is a group of states headed by Vanuatu that is currently working on a General Assembly draft resolution that would seek an advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice precisely on that. The implication of the sea level rise for international borders and for other aspects of international relations. This is not necessarily related to refugees directly, but obviously, depending on what happens in this particular area, of course, it would and it could have further implications also on the refugee situation. And then from the internal kitchen of the Security Council, which, as you know, unfortunately is blocked in many ways, specifically now due to the Russian Federation as an aggressor against Ukraine, blocking any efficient action in this context due to the veto right. But there has been an effort already for about 5 to 7 years in the Security Council to pass a resolution on security and climate. So far, it hasn't happened because the divisions unfortunately still prevail. In particular, two permanent members of the Security Council, Russia and China, oppose that effort, and they say that this is not an issue that should be addressed by the Security Council because it should only address imminent issues taking place in the area of maintenance of international peace and security. But one has to add that obviously that responsibility also applies to conflict prevention and to being able to see beyond the horizon. So there is an effort still ongoing that was last year actually spearheaded by Norway and Ireland. These two countries are no longer on the Security Council. UK has been very supportive as well, and I think it's only a matter of time when this will finally have to be done. Of course, an important effort needs to go into this particular area. Thank you.
I just wanted to also raise the point about the distinction that was being raised between refugees and migrants in the sense of the amount of agency. With migrants, obviously, they're able to enter and move about as economic migrants, so their options are going to be quite a bit greater. The displacement that's going to happen with climate refugees is that they're probably going to be internally for a period of time, and then there's a lot of systemic differences from country to country in terms of the ability of countries to facilitate the refugee movement. So what happens in a lot of African nations, the migrants would have to continue to go to multiple places of displacement before they end up in their final the final destination of where they're going to. And then another thing that we're recognizing in Canada is that there's probably already climate refugees that are here. We're just not actually tracking them in terms of having an understanding of who they are, which suggests the fact that there are a lot of climate migrants that have been actually subverting the system to a certain extent.
Thank you. Yes.
So I have a couple of questions. Maybe, okay, I should put the mic. So I have a couple of questions. The first question, Diego, is to you specifically. That you talked about how if we thought about climate change seriously and the confluence between climate change and security, the response or the policies in Afghanistan or Haiti would be different or would be configured in a different way. So it'll be great to hear an example of that. And then to the panel, you know, right now, I mean, in Shamar Sheikh, before that in Scotland, I mean, every year we have a COP right now. But what we have been seeing with the COP and in general is that, you know, Vanuatu making that speech, I think it was Vanuatu making that speech with, you know, in the water, the Prime Minister, the President, I mean, I'm not sure who it was. And it was a very sort of evocative moment that he was making that speech saying that we are literally, you know, we're drowning. And people, you know, really admire that, but then you don't sort of see the impact of that in the thinking around climate fund, in the thinking around sort of how do we actually protect populations which are going to be displaced because of climate change and all of that. And then the other aspect with COP is that there's really not sort of, you know, substantive engagement with affected populations. And the more work I do is that I mean, it's a state-centric system, we have to trust governments, and governments are about, I mean, they're representative, and in the end, I mean, that rationale exists. But what I'm seeing more and more from the global community is that government are actually not responsive. They're only sort of about preserving national interest in many, many ways. So how do we sort of get out of this conundrum? Like, is this a global movement? And if it is a global movement, what it looks like? And also sort of, are there any other examples of a similar kind of threat which the global community, that is the citizenry and the populations, have come together and faced? I mean, the only thing I can think about is the suffragette movement for the rights of women, but it was again very diffused, and it was global, but it was again very diffused. So just some thoughts. I mean, I'm not asking for any solutions because none of us have them, but just.
So I will quickly address the first question. I've been 20-something years doing this kind of stuff, and it's a pattern, you know. People have a problem, and then they come with very normative policies, and so we have the elections, we have the electoral background, we have the political issues, and then the whole thing is going to yield the economic part, and then everybody's going to be happy. Kumbaya. We have seen that that doesn't work. Is that Afghanistan, Liberia, Iraq, somehow is not this right sequence. Before people voting, they need to eat. And before eating, they need to feel that there is safety and security. And that can only be created if we accept that the development of human societies is organic, and it cannot be so normatively imposed or transferred from another place. You cannot copy what happens in the Balkans and have democracy translated into Afghanistan. The results are there 3 trillion after. Right. So one thing is that some people have issued already some documents and some analysis. Look, we have seen Afghanistan for what it is from the climate change and security perspective. You will have given a different sequence in terms of what you need to do. And you have these reconstruction conferences like Tokyo and Bonn, in which people say, let's go for the Nigeria, let's go for this analysis, let's go for a constitution. It will give us a different angle, right? Same thing with the case of Haiti. We keep banging our heads that we're going for elections. And yeah, it's important, democracy, all these things, but they are now about survival. And that survival is linked to the fact that the territory, for whatever reason, cannot sustain them anymore because there has been a huge ecological destruction of the place. So on top of that, you have the security and the many elements, but you have to address the whole thing as a whole big ecosystem. And our thinking, our way of looking at it, from diplomacy, from security, is very reductionist. It's very one causality. That needs to change. So that's on that.
I will pick up a little bit on the second part that you have asked. Obviously, a key task remains mitigation and adaptation. That remains at the core of our efforts for all the COP meetings that you have referred to, also for COP28 that will be coming up later this year. Yes, we do require further focus and further effort related to climate action in general. In addition to the COP, in September, Secretary General of the United Nations Guterres is convening a climate ambition summit for the leaders who will be coming to New York to the UN General Assembly. And 2 days before the opening of the General Assembly, there will be the Climate Ambition Summit, immediately followed by the SDG Summit. So, of course, really a lot of attention will be focused on these issues. And the purpose is exactly what also you have mentioned. The purpose is to really refocus our attention and be able to mobilize all the important stakeholders to be able to move ahead, because the usual process of COP negotiations of course is there, and this is what we have established over the years, but it doesn't happen without pushing, without leadership, and without activism. And this is precisely what leads me to what you have also referred to. And I believe we need to see continued youth activism in particular. It may have started with Greta Thunberg, but it's much more than that. It's much wider than that. And I have seen in my own eyes in recent, let's say, 5 to 7 years, that the activism actually does have practical impact on the decision makers. Yes, we have all seen some of the tough images coming from Glasgow and other places also before. Well, it's just of course what we can see in the media. And I would say it's just really a symptom of what is behind all that. But without all the important stakeholders, also NGOs, grassroots movement people, you can hardly expect leaders to just move on their own. It's sad, but it's what it is. Because in general, I think we are experiencing in today's world a crisis of leadership. Leaders thinking too much of just the current and maybe the next electoral cycle, and they don't necessarily look beyond. And this is an issue where we need to see beyond, where we need to take into account the future generations, and that will be at the core of the upcoming summit of the future that will be taking place in New York in September of 2024, and we are starting preparations for the summit. So I think we have a lot of important building blocks. Of course, now the question is how to take advantage of them in such a way that we are able to get tangible results. Because if we don't do the 1.5 degrees, we know we are doomed. It's not a theoretical concept that maybe it happens or maybe it doesn't, as some would have preferred to persuade us. but it's a reality. And let me conclude by saying something that I've already mentioned: the 70% of carbon actually being generated in the cities. And in this country also, the city's role, or the role of the governors, the state level and the municipal level, is absolutely crucial. We have seen that earlier when the administration decided to leave the Paris Climate Accord, and many of the governors and mayors, they spoke up and they said, no, of course we have to stay the course. We need to continue implementing these targets in our own setting. I don't know if it provides any, of course, any practical solutions. I'm afraid not, but at least it leads us to to think beyond some of the typical aspects. Yeah. Thank you.
Good morning. First of all, thank you so much to all the panelists for coming out tonight and speaking at the symposium. My name is Felix. I'm a sophomore studying international relations and civic studies here at Tufts. And as Professor Osaria, you mentioned, this really is a matter of governance. Fixing climate change is a matter of governance. My big question is, how do we get to the point where all these countries can come together and actually accept that this is an issue? Because there seem to be a lot of barriers to countries accepting climate change as a reason for acting against climate change. There also seem to be a lot of barriers for countries really accepting that they are a part of the problem. So how do we convince countries that they are also part of the problem and that everyone needs to come together and act for the future? Thank you.
Do either of you speakers online, would you like to answer that question?
Sure. I think different levels of government are going to take a greater interest when they start to realize that the economic costs of not dealing with climate change or dealing with climate migration. That seems in Canada, where we rely so heavily on the oil and gas sector to allow for other things that Canadians take for granted. And the realization then that fossil fuels are not going to be the future has been sort of part of it, so there's some concerns that way. And then as a major destination that a lot of refugees and migrants want to come to, that in itself is going to suggest other sort of economic costs. So I think that it's really the economic arguments in the end that are going to be the most persuasive.
Can I say something? Whether you believe in democracy or not, as a conceptual framework, the fact of the matter is that a lot of priorities are established by the percentages that show in the election. And so, whether we accept the idea of democracy, or as a scholar put it the other day, I think his name is Peter Jones, who works on the demise of the Roman Empire, whether we have elected oligarchies, at the end of the day, those who vote get to have a say. And because we are segmenting our governance in terms of electoral cycles, at least in the Western democracy, it is true, it's very difficult to ask a prime minister or a president, commit political suicide and have all the right measures, because you won't get elected. I mean, tell the Canadian prime minister, tell the whole of Western Canada that oil is out, and you will have no chance in the future. So somehow these generational and existential issues need to be either superimposed on the institutional framework, or give them a different type of scale, or facilitate an engagement by which people don't have to do harakiri electorally when they actually take the courage of actually doing something about the environment. And that depends a lot on one key issue, participation. If you vote and everybody votes and people are involved in different elements, you know, there's one thing about global governance in the year 2023 to 2023, which is that it is very diffuse as well, but it's very within your grasp. You see something that doesn't work, you can launch an NGO and the thing actually shows up, and in a few weeks you're talking to prime ministers and stuff like that. It is doable. So if you care about your grandchildren, get going, because that's the no other way around. And by doing it, then you are creating the space in which the politicians, if they mean well, and many of them do, will have the space to actually do something. Because otherwise it's kind of impossible, and they are forced to kick the can down the road.
Thanks very much for the question. Just very quickly, I fully agree. It's a governance issue. It's a leadership issue, as I have mentioned earlier as well. And what Diego mentioned about participation is absolutely right. You know, I often say that the future starts today. It's not a theoretical perspective somewhere down the road, and I think our political leaders need to be reminded of that. That you know, when they are making decisions today, it actually really affects things for the future generations, and you know, credible leadership requires that. What we need is action, because I think we all know we have the science, we have the data, we have the commitments. The key question is, of course, how to turn all that into action and into practical solutions, as you said, that need to be happening. Part of the answer, I believe, is also in networking all the various actors, and we have been trying to improve that also in the UN context. You know, in the UN context, we have ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council, but then, but it's not necessarily the most efficient organ that exists in the international, in the structure of international organizations. So, you know, one of the ideas that we have been working on is to better actually connect ECOSOC to the G7 and the G20. And it's a key platform. You know, the G20 indeed is a platform that needs to be more focused precisely on climate change, and the IFIs, the international financial institutions that play a key motivational role, if you will, or that have additional tools at their disposal that can help us, you know, move in the right direction. We need champions, and they are not necessarily in abundance. So, for various reasons, as I have said earlier, too many of them may be thinking in their own electoral cycles, or they follow, you know, too much the feelings or the sentiments of their electorate today, rather than you know, talking to the people and explaining to them why certain policies are necessary. So, but I'm really hopeful that by being able to better network ECOSOC in the UN, G7 and G20, also with the IFIs, we can achieve some positive results that would make it a little bit easier for the political leaders to you know, to act.
Thank you. I think we are over time, but I think we have time for one more question. Carlos, I know you've been waiting.
Hi, thank you all so much for being here. Super enlightening panel. Really appreciated the diverse set of inputs. I'm Carlos. I'm a second-year Fletcher student studying climate and energy at the Fletcher School. I just had a quick question about debt trap diplomacy and whether it's overhyped. I'm just, you know, 90-something% of climate finance comes in the form of loans. I'm just wondering whether you think that this is going to be a problem in the long term, whether you think that this poses equity issues, or whether it's generally overhyped in the literature and it's a necessary step for the green energy transition.
I will give you one quick one, and then I give it to the other experts to give you more content back. I was at COP 25th in Madrid, and I met somebody from the Seychelles, and he said, "Well, we have been trying to get funding from the GCF, the Green Fund, and we just don't have the technical capacity to get the proposal in the right way to pass the fiduciary element." I was the deputy director of Trust Fund in Haiti, and the fiduciary element is important, right?
Yes.
But then if you put a whole funding and the whole framework of funding just on the basis of making sure the money is well spent vis-a-vis the fiduciary element,
Yeah.
you don't necessarily get to act on the fast food. So that plus the debt and everything else implies that we cannot really waste the money. We have to be very careful on how you spend it, but you need to also prioritize in terms of what needs to be done.
Yeah.
And racism, inequality, and many other things lead to the fact that, yes, Marshall Islands, Seychelles, you have 2 or 3 diplomats and others don't. There is an institution called Independent Diplomat that helps certain countries that don't have the capacity to stand in front of the huge delegations of 300 people from other countries. So that is an inequality. Somehow we need to do that. The bank, the World Bank, when they realized that they weren't spending money fast enough to deal with issues of climate change and conflict, they created regulations so that they will spend the money faster. Well, I think the World Bank is going to come big in terms of climate change, and so the other financial institutions, they will need to do something that is specifically linked and framed around climate.
I'll pick up on that briefly. Indeed, the debt crisis is the most looming crisis of today. Of course, linked to climate change, but linked to the other crises that we are going through, mostly due to the current geopolitical realities. Whether it's financial, food, fuel, but it's economic and social crises in general. So we will need bold new decisions that need to be taken, and they need to be they need to involve a lot of out of the box thinking. It's shocking that 80% of the debt in Africa that we are actually addressing today, including at the UN, is the so-called Chinese debt. It's not criticism; it's just statement of the fact. So it is absolutely essential for us when we have these discussions, whether it's in ECOSOC or in G20, as I have mentioned, or with the IFIs, that China needs to be part of those discussions. Because so far they have basically taken a backseat and a very cautious approach that they have nothing to do with that, because part of the narrative is that China remains a developing country, and it doesn't want to be on the side of the donor community talking about these things with the recipients. Just to simplify it, of course, it is a bit more complicated. This is an imperative of the day, and for other reasons, but including for this reason, the future relationship between the United States and China will be absolutely critical. We all see that there is no way Russia will come out of the current crisis strengthened. It has lost already. The question is, to what extent its future position will be defined, or will be defining the world order. But the crucial relationship will no longer be between, let's say, United States and Russia. It will definitely be between the United States and China. So this is where we have to focus a lot of our efforts.
Thank you. Either of the online panelists, if you have something to add, please do so.
Yeah, I had something just really quick here. I know we're over time. Part of that question was whether diplomacy might be overblown. And what I think, at least from the United States perspective, is there's the three levers of foreign policy. There's defense, development, and diplomacy. And so I think with diplomacy, we've too long relied upon consensus on peer-reviewed science and what drives the process in terms of the Paris Accords and the COPs. But also we need to look at the other levers of diplomacy. So we need to have development assistance that's not contingent, that's not from the multilateral institutions, but is framed in terms of foreign assistance projects that build resilience, but also have other purposes. Also in terms of defense, engagement between militaries, assistance in disaster response, in some of those other areas, but not necessarily always leading with the diplomatic approach, knowing that all parts of the government should be engaged, so it should be a whole of government approach, but also all parts of society and civil society and even individual groups that can interact with their foreign partners. So it should be a whole of government and a whole of society approach, and not necessarily always led by the diplomatic instrument.
Okay, thank you so much. And on behalf of the EPIIC program, thank you to all of our panelists. Today has been very insightful, and we have all learned a lot from you, so thank you so much for taking the time to be here today.
Pleasure with the panelists online as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Morale.